I can still remember the way they looked at me that night, the amusement barely concealed behind fake sympathy, the knowing smirks exchanged between them, the subtle shake of my mother's head as if I had just announced something completely absurd. It wasn't outright hostility, not yet, but it was worse in some ways. It was pity, that quiet, condescending kind of disbelief that made it clear they didn't take me seriously. That they thought this was nothing more than a phase I'd grow out of when reality hit me hard enough. It had started at one of our regular family gatherings, the kind where everyone drank too much wine and bragged about their latest promotions, their bonuses, their so-called accomplishments, while silently measuring themselves against one another like it was some kind of competition no one had agreed to enter. My cousin Nathan, the golden boy of the family, was in the middle of yet another long-winded speech about his new position at some finance firm, detailing his salary, his benefits, the company car, throwing in just enough fake humility to keep himself from sounding outright arrogant. He had always been the kind of person who talked about himself like he was the protagonist in a story where everyone else was just background noise, and for as long as I could remember, he had been the loudest voice in the room when it came to criticizing anyone who dared to take an unconventional path in life. "So, Ava," he had said, turning toward me with that insufferable smirk, already knowing exactly what he was about to do, "what's new with you? Any job prospects, or are you still doing that little business thing you mentioned last time?" I felt every pair of eyes at the table shift toward me, my mother already sighing into her wine glass, my aunt exchanging a barely perceptible glance with my uncle, the same unspoken judgment hanging in the air between them. They were all waiting for me to admit defeat, to say I had come to my senses and abandoned my ridiculous dream, to finally validate everything they had been whispering about behind my back. I forced myself to smile, keeping my expression calm, refusing to let them see the exhaustion that had been weighing me down for months, the long nights, the financial stress, the creeping self-doubt that I had been battling in silence. I had just launched my business a few months earlier, pouring every dime of my savings into it, working endless hours to keep it afloat, making sacrifices they couldn't even begin to understand. But I knew that nothing I said was going to change their perception of me. "I'm still working on it," I said, keeping my voice even, not giving them the satisfaction of knowing how hard it had been, how many times I had questioned myself, how close I had come to believing the things they said about me. Nathan let out a short laugh, shaking his head, looking around the table as if to make sure everyone else was hearing the same nonsense. "Wow," he said, drawing out the word like he couldn't believe it, like he was waiting for me to realize how foolish I sounded. "I mean, good for you, I guess, but come on, Ava. You're smart. You could get a real job if you wanted to. There's still time to, you know."
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Do something stable before you waste too many years on this. The words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I didn't let it show, didn't let my expression waver, didn't let him see the way my stomach twisted at the idea that they all agreed with him. "You should listen to him," my mother chimed in, her voice laced with forced concern, though I could hear the underlying exasperation, the thinly veiled disappointment that had been there since the moment I told her I was quitting my job. "He's just being honest with you. It's nice that you want to follow your dreams, but let's be practical here, sweetheart. You can't live off hope and ambition forever." I clenched my jaw, nodding, knowing there was no point in arguing, no point in trying to defend myself, no point in explaining that I had already landed my first few big clients, that I was slowly but surely building something that mattered, that I had spent every waking moment fighting to make this work. Because to them, none of that was real. To them, success only counted if it came with a corporate title, a steady paycheck, a comfortable, predictable life. As the conversation moved on without me, as they turned back to discussing Nathan's latest achievements, I sat there in silence, gripping my glass a little too tightly, making a silent promise to myself that I would prove them wrong, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard it was. Because if there was one thing I had learned, it was that nothing felt better than proving people wrong. Starting a business was harder than I ever could have imagined, harder than any of the late-night articles I had read, harder than the success stories made it seem, harder than my own expectations had prepared me for, but I was too stubborn, too determined, too desperate to prove them all wrong to let myself quit. The long hours stretched endlessly, each day bleeding into the next, my nights spent hunched over my laptop, running numbers, drafting emails, tweaking marketing plans, trying to stretch every dollar as far as it could possibly go while pretending I wasn't terrified that I had made the biggest mistake of my life. The money was tight, painfully, suffocatingly tight, and there were weeks when I wasn't sure how I was going to make rent, when I lived off cheap instant meals, when I skipped social gatherings not because I was busy, but because I literally couldn't afford a single unnecessary expense. I worked myself to exhaustion, waking up before the sun rose, collapsing into bed long after midnight, my mind constantly spinning with ideas, fears, calculations, contingency plans, the never-ending loop of what if this doesn't work? Whispering at the back of my mind no matter how hard I tried to silence it. And through it all, my family kept talking about me as if my failure was a foregone conclusion, as if they were just waiting for me to admit defeat and come crawling back with my tail between my legs. They never outright asked how I was doing, never bothered to check in beyond the occasional, thinly veiled comment at family gatherings, but I knew what they were saying when I wasn't around, knew the kinds of things they whispered behind closed doors. She's always been a dreamer, but reality's going to hit her eventually. I just hope she realizes it before she loses everything. At some point, she'll have to swallow her pride and get a real job. I heard the comments through mutual friends, through slip-ups and casual conversations, through the looks they gave me when they thought I wasn't paying attention, and every single one of them burned, fueling that slow, simmering rage deep in my chest that pushed me to keep going even when I wanted to give up. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, things started to shift in my favor. It started with small wins, with a few clients here and there, people who believed in what I was offering, people who gave me a chance when I had nothing but determination and sheer force of will to back me up. I poured every bit of energy I had into making sure they never regretted hiring me, working harder than I ever had in my life, proving myself over and over again until word of mouth began to spread. Then came the first big client, the kind of contract that made me feel like I could actually breathe for the first time in months, the kind that meant I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was starting to grow. I wanted to tell someone, wanted to call someone and celebrate, wanted to finally shove the proof of my success in their faces and watch their expressions shift as they realized how wrong they had been about me, but I didn't. Instead, I chose silence, chose patience, chose to let them keep believing whatever they wanted, because I knew the moment would come when the truth would reveal itself in a way they could never ignore. So I waited, biding my time, listening to their mocking comments, their condescending advice, their thinly veiled insults, knowing that one day soon, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. The moment I walked into my mother's house, I could feel the familiar weight of judgment pressing down on me, the same suffocating atmosphere that always accompanied these forced family gatherings, where success was measured not by personal fulfillment, but by job titles, salaries, and the ability to impress others with stories of promotions and corporate achievements. The smell of home-cooked food drifted through the air, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filling the space, but beneath the warmth of the scene was something far colder, something unspoken yet deeply ingrained, the unwavering belief that I had made a mistake, that I was still the family disappointment, that I was the one who hadn't figured life out like the rest of them had. I took my usual place at the long dining table, sliding into my chair just in time to hear Nathan's voice carrying over the conversation. His tone effortlessly smug as he launched into yet another one of his self-important monologues about his so-called career struggles, speaking as if he was delivering an inspirational speech about resilience instead of what it really was. A desperate attempt to maintain the illusion that he was destined for greatness. "You wouldn't believe how competitive the job market is right now," he said, shaking his head dramatically as he reached for his wine glass, his voice filled with exaggerated exhaustion, as if he had spent months tirelessly searching instead of half-heartedly applying to positions that fit his inflated sense of worth. "I mean, obviously, companies want someone with my experience, but you know how it is. Sometimes the perfect opportunity just takes a little longer to come along. The table erupted into nods of sympathy, murmurs of agreement, empty reassurances that Nathan was too talented, too smart, too capable to be struggling for long, each person rushing to feed his ego before it could deflate even slightly. My mother leaned forward with an indulgent smile, her voice warm and filled with the kind of maternal pride she had never once directed toward me, as if Nathan were her own son instead of just a nephew she had always favored. "Well, we all know you'll land somewhere incredible," she said, giving his arm a gentle squeeze, her eyes glowing with admiration. "Any company would be lucky to have you." Nathan let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if he was too humble to agree outright, but too arrogant to deny it entirely, before setting his glass down with a deliberate pause, waiting just long enough for the room to quiet before delivering his grand announcement, the news he had clearly been holding on to just long enough to ensure he had everyone's full attention. "Actually," he said, stretching out the word as he glanced around the table, reveling in the anticipation, "I just applied for a position at this amazing company. Seriously, top tier. Competitive pay, great benefits, huge potential for growth. I mean, it's the kind of place that could really set me up for success, you know?" The reaction was immediate and exactly what he had been hoping for, a wave of excitement, nods of approval, exclamations of how proud everyone was, how perfect the opportunity sounded, how it was exactly what Nathan deserved after all of his so-called struggles. My aunt clapped her hands together, beaming as if her own son had just announced he was becoming a CEO. My uncle muttered something about how it's about time the right company recognized his talent, and my mother, of course, was already comparing him to me, as she always did, as if I was nothing more than the unfortunate cautionary tale sitting at the end of the table. "Now that is what I like to hear," she said with a pointed glance in my direction, her voice laced with condescension, the same tone she always used when she wanted to remind me that she had never once believed in what I was doing. "See, Ava? That's the kind of opportunity you should be looking for. A stable job, a real career, something that actually has a future." I forced a polite smile, biting back the urge to laugh, to tell her that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life by assuming I was still the struggling failure she thought I was, but I said nothing, because the moment wasn't mine yet. Nathan took another sip of his wine, clearly basking in the attention, before casually dropping the name of the company he had applied to, as if it was just another part of his story, as if it wasn't about to change everything, as if he had any idea who was really sitting across from him at that table. I felt my heartbeat slow, my fingers curling just slightly around the stem of my glass, my expression perfectly neutral as his words settled into the air like a slow-burning fuse inching toward an explosion that no one else could see coming. Because that company, the one Nathan had just bragged about, the one he believed would be the key to his success, the one he had described as top-tier, competitive, full of potential, was mine. I glanced around the table, watching as my family continued their enthusiastic praise, completely unaware of what had just happened, completely oblivious to the fact that their golden boy had just unknowingly placed his future in the hands of the very woman they had spent years dismissing. I could have spoken up then, could have told them all exactly who I was, exactly what I had built, exactly how wrong they had been, but instead, I simply took a sip of my wine, nodding along as if I was just another spectator in the room, hiding my amusement behind the quiet satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow morning, Nathan would walk into his dream job interview, only to find me sitting on the other side of the desk. The next morning, I arrived at my office earlier than usual, taking my time settling in, making sure everything was in place, preparing myself for the moment that I had been waiting for ever since I heard Nathan say the name of my company at the dinner table. I had barely slept the night before, not because of nerves or uncertainty, but because I had been too busy replaying every single thing he had ever said to me, every insult, every dismissive comment. Every time he had laughed at my ambition like it was a joke, every time he had looked at me like I was lesser just because I had chosen to build something of my own instead of following the path that he and the rest of the family had deemed acceptable. I wanted to savor the moment, wanted to stretch it out just long enough to watch the full realization dawn on him, to see the confidence drain from his face the second he understood exactly who held his future in their hands. So I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly, my fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of my desk as I waited for the assistant outside to escort him in, knowing that right now, at this very second, Nathan was probably sitting in the lobby, going over his resume, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. A soft knock at the door signaled his arrival, and I straightened my posture, smoothing down the front of my blazer before nodding toward my assistant, keeping my expression composed, my voice calm, my demeanor professional as I gave the simple instruction that would change everything. Send him in. The door swung open, and for the first few seconds, Nathan walked in with the same arrogant self-assurance that had always defined him, his chin lifted slightly, his shoulders squared, his entire posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been humbled a day in his life. He wasn't nervous, wasn't uncertain, wasn't the least bit intimidated, because he still thought he had control, still believed that this was just another interview where he would sit across from someone who would immediately be impressed by his credentials, someone who would nod approvingly at his exaggerated accomplishments and polished answers, someone who would see him as the brilliant, untouchable professional that he imagined himself to be. Then his eyes landed on me. For a moment, nothing happened. His body locked up mid-step, his breath catching slightly in his throat, his entire demeanor shifting so rapidly that if I hadn't been watching for it, I might have missed it. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to say something, but no words came out, because for the first time in his life, Nathan didn't know what to say, didn't know how to spin the situation, didn't know how to talk his way out of the sudden, brutal realization that the company he had spent the last few days praising was owned by the very cousin he had spent years tearing down. I let the silence stretch, let him stew in the weight of it, let him stand there, motionless, as the truth settled over him like a slow-building nightmare that he couldn't escape from, before finally tilting my head slightly, raising an eyebrow, my tone light, almost amused, when I finally broke the tension. "Nathan," I said, watching as he visibly flinched at the sound of his name coming from my mouth, his face caught somewhere between horror and disbelief. "I didn't expect to see you here." He blinked rapidly, his usual cocky smirk replaced by something much more uncertain, much more fragile, his confidence fracturing right in front of me as he scrambled to recover, to find some way to pretend that this wasn't happening, to regain the upper hand that had so thoroughly slipped from his grasp. Ava, he stammered, swallowing hard, forcing a weak laugh that held none of the arrogance it usually did, shifting awkwardly in place as he tried to pull himself together. "Wow, I had no idea this was your company. That's, really great for you, seriously. I mean, I always knew you had potential." I almost laughed at that, at the desperate attempt to rewrite history, at the blatant backpedaling, at the way he was already scrambling to undo years of belittling me, hoping that I would somehow forget every word he had ever said just because he suddenly needed something from me. But I kept my expression neutral, my voice even, my posture relaxed as I gestured toward the chair across from me, my tone polite but firm. "Well," I said smoothly, "why don't you take a seat and we'll get started?" He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before forcing himself forward, his movement stiff, unnatural, deeply uncomfortable, as he lowered himself into the chair, his hands clasped tightly together, his smile strained, his mind clearly racing with every possible way to salvage this disaster. For the first time ever, Nathan was on the other side of the power dynamic, and I had never felt more in control. Nathan sat across from me, his posture stiff, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had started to turn white, his forced smile flickering at the edges as he struggled to maintain the illusion of composure. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, could practically see the desperate calculations running behind his eyes as he tried to figure out how to salvage the disaster that had just unfolded in front of him. As he scrambled to rewrite history in real time, as he grappled with the horrifying realization that he had spent years mocking the very person now holding his career in their hands. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms loosely across my chest, taking my time as I studied him, letting the silence stretch between us like a thin wire ready to snap, letting him feel the weight of his own past words pressing down on him. He had walked into this office fully expecting to impress a faceless hiring manager, someone he could manipulate with a well-rehearsed speech about his qualifications, someone who would nod along while he spun whatever version of himself was most convenient, someone who had no idea who he really was. Instead, he had walked straight into a reckoning he never saw coming. "So, Nathan," I said finally, keeping my voice light, polite, perfectly professional, watching as he visibly tensed at the sound of my voice, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Why don't you start by telling me why you want to work here?" He let out an awkward chuckle, shifting in his chair, his usual confidence nowhere to be found, his cocky demeanor replaced with something closer to carefully constructed humility. The kind of forced sincerity that came from someone who knew they were backed into a corner with no way out. "Well, Ava," he started, his tone almost too casual, as if he was trying to revert back to the version of himself that had always held the upper hand, as if he still believed that maybe, just maybe, he could charm his way through this. "I've always been really interested in, what your company is doing. I think it's really impressive how you've built this from the ground up, and, I've always believed in you. I mean, obviously, I might have joked around a little before, but that's just family stuff, right? I've always had your back." I smiled, tilting my head slightly, pretending to consider his words, pretending that I hadn't heard every insult he had ever thrown at me, every time he had laughed at my struggles, every moment he had dismissed my ambition as nothing more than a ridiculous waste of time. "Oh, of course," I said smoothly, my voice carrying just the slightest hint of amusement, watching as his expression flickered with unease, as if some part of him was starting to realize that I wasn't just going to let him talk his way out of this. "I mean, I remember all those conversations so well. Like that time you said I'd never make a living off this little project, or when you joked that I'd come crawling back for a real job within a year. That was just family stuff, right?" His smile froze on his face, his fingers twitching slightly against the edge of his chair, his eyes darting to the door for just a fraction of a second, as if he was trying to figure out if he could somehow escape this conversation altogether. "Ava, come on," he said, his laugh coming out forced, strained, completely devoid of the arrogance that had once been second nature to him. I didn't mean it like that. I was just messing around, that's what we do. We joke, we give each other a hard time, but that's just how family works, right?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the desk, letting the amusement in my expression slowly shift into something more unreadable, something colder, something that made his smile falter completely. "I don't know, Nathan," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly steady, perfectly controlled, even as I watched the nervous sweat begin to form at his temples. "Because from where I'm sitting, it kind of seems like you didn't take me seriously until it was convenient for you." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that wrapped itself around his throat like a noose, forcing him to sit there and take in the full weight of what he had done, what he had said, what he had assumed about me all these years. For the first time in his life, Nathan was completely at my mercy, and he knew it. I could have crushed him right then, could have thrown his resume back across the desk and told him to get out, could have ended this little game with a single sentence, but instead, I leaned back again, exhaling slowly, tilting my head as if I was truly considering my next move, as if I hadn't already made up my mind the second he sat down. "I'll tell you what," I said finally, watching as his shoulders visibly stiffened, his breath hitching slightly, his hands still gripping his chair so tightly that I thought he might snap the armrests in half. "I'm going to make you an offer." His eyes widened slightly, hope flickering across his face for the first time since he walked into the room, but I wasn't done. "I have a position available," I continued, keeping my expression unreadable, letting him hold on to that fleeting sense of relief for just a moment longer before I took it away again. "It's not quite what you applied for, but I think it might be a great fit. Entry level, assistant work, long hours, nothing glamorous, but hey, it's a foot in the door, right?" His face dropped instantly, his hope crashing into disappointment so fast that I almost felt bad almost. You mean, he hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper, his ego visibly crumbling at the realization that I wasn't going to hand him the job he thought he deserved, that he was going to have to prove himself, that for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to be handed something just because he expected it. I smiled, my voice light, almost cheerful, as I delivered the final blow. That, or you can walk out right now, I said, watching as his fingers twitched slightly, as he stared down at his resume like it could somehow change reality. Totally up to you. For the first time ever, Nathan had to decide whether he was willing to work for something or walk away in defeat. Nathan stared at me in stunned silence, his jaw tightening, his fingers twitching ever so slightly against the edges of his resume, his entire body visibly recoiling from the reality of what I had just laid out in front of him. He had walked into this room fully expecting to be handed an impressive title, a generous salary, an opportunity that would allow him to climb the corporate ladder with minimal effort, but now, as he sat across from me, he was realizing that he was being given something far different, something far beneath what he believed he was entitled to, something that he had never once considered himself too desperate to take, until now. For a long moment, he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing slightly, as if he was struggling to find the right words, as if he was weighing whether or not it was worth swallowing his pride just to keep himself from walking out of here with nothing. His confidence, once so unshakable, once so effortless, once so bulletproof, had completely crumbled under the weight of his own ego. And I could see the internal battle written all over his face as he fought against the humiliation of knowing that he would now have to work for the cousin he had spent years belittling. Finally, he let out a forced, uneasy laugh, shaking his head slightly as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk in what was clearly an attempt to salvage whatever scrap of control he thought he still had. "Come on, Ava," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his voice strained, his tone carefully controlled as if he thought he could still talk his way out of this. "You and I both know I'm overqualified for a position like that. I mean, I appreciate the offer really, but let's be honest, there's got to be something better suited to my skills." I tilted my head slightly, watching him closely, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably in his seat before I finally spoke, my voice calm, steady, completely unreadable. "Your skills," I repeated slowly, as if I was truly considering the idea, as if I was giving his words the weight he so desperately wanted them to have. "That's an interesting choice of words, Nathan, because from where I'm sitting, I don't actually see a whole lot of demonstrated skills on your resume, just a long list of places you've worked for a year or two before moving on to the next best thing." His face twitched slightly at that, his forced smile faltering, his shoulders tensing as he realized that I had seen straight through him, that I wasn't going to entertain the same inflated version of himself that he had been selling to everyone else. "That's not fair," he said quickly, his voice tight, his fingers curling against his knee as if he was trying to keep himself from reacting too obviously. "I've had plenty of experience. I mean, sure, I've moved around a bit, but that's just part of the process. You know how it is, gotta keep looking for the right fit, the right opportunity, the right—" I held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence, my patience wearing thin, my amusement starting to fade into something sharper, something far less forgiving. Something that no longer had the energy to entertain his endless attempts to dance around reality. "Nathan," I said, my voice carrying an edge that made him immediately stop talking, his lips pressing together, his eyes locked onto mine. "Here's the truth. I don't owe you a job. I don't owe you anything, actually. And if you don't want the position I'm offering, that's completely fine. There's the door. But this is the only offer you're getting from me, so if you think you're too good for it, feel free to walk." He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he let out a long, frustrated breath, his gaze darting toward the exit for a brief moment before flicking back to me, his desperation warring with his pride in a battle that was written across every tense line of his expression. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to not being in control of the conversation, not being able to charm his way into what he wanted, not being able to dictate the terms of his own success, and now, as he sat here, realizing that he had no leverage, no bargaining power, no way to manipulate the situation in his favor, he was trapped in a decision he had never imagined himself having to make. For the first time in his life, Nathan had to choose between swallowing his ego and walking away with nothing. I waited, my expression unreadable, my hands folded neatly on the desk in front of me, my patience unwavering as he sat there, his mind racing, his confidence shattered, his reality forcibly rewritten by the very person he had once dismissed as insignificant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a quiet sigh, his shoulders sinking, his expression tightening into something dangerously close to reluctant defeat. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying the word out loud physically pained him, as if admitting that he needed this job more than he needed to protect his ego was the hardest thing he had ever done. I smiled slightly, nodding once, my voice cool, professional, as I slid the contract across the desk toward him. "Great," I said simply, watching as he stared at the document in front of him like it was some kind of cruel joke, like signing it would somehow mark the end of whatever version of himself he had built up in his own head. "Welcome to the team." He hesitated for only a second before reaching for the pen, his hand trembling just slightly as he scribbled his name at the bottom of the page, sealing his fate, cementing the reality that he now worked for the cousin he had spent years treating like a failure. I watched him carefully, my expression giving nothing away, because the truth was, this wasn't over. Not yet, not by a long shot. The real question wasn't whether or not he had taken the job, but whether or not he had it in him to actually keep it. Nathan showed up for his first day at work looking like a man who had just swallowed broken glass, his usual arrogance dulled to something far less polished, his confidence noticeably cracked, his entire demeanor screaming that he still hadn't fully processed the reality of what he had agreed to. He had expected an easy ride, had assumed that he would land a high-paying role where he could sit in a nice office, give half-hearted effort, and impress people with his ability to talk his way through anything, but instead, he was starting from the absolute bottom, forced to work under people he had once considered beneath him, answering to supervisors who didn't care about his last name or his family connections, struggling to keep up in an environment that demanded results instead of empty promises. I didn't go easy on him, didn't offer him special treatment, didn't make things easier just because of our history, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that people like Nathan never truly understood failure until they were forced to experience it firsthand. His first few weeks were a disaster, his frustration barely concealed as he stumbled through assignments, as he realized that his charm and smooth talking meant nothing here, as he discovered that respect had to be earned, not handed out like some family inheritance. He was used to being in control, used to having people fawn over him, used to being the golden child who could do no wrong, but now he was just another employee, just another cog in the machine, just another person expected to pull his weight without complaint. I watched him closely, waiting to see if he would rise to the challenge or let the weight of his own pride drag him down, waiting to see if he would fight to prove himself or walk away the moment things got too hard, waiting to see if he had the spine to push through or the cowardice to cut and run when the reality of hard work finally settled in. And for a while, it seemed like he might actually try, like he might finally be willing to swallow his ego and learn, like he might understand that the world didn't owe him anything, that the success he had always assumed would come easily had to be earned through effort instead of entitlement. But old habits die hard, and within a few months, the cracks started to show, the same arrogance creeping back into his voice, the same impatience surfacing in his attitude, the same entitlement poisoning everything he did. He started slacking off, started blaming others for his mistakes, started acting like the job was beneath him, started complaining that he was being undervalued, that his skills were being wasted, that he was too good for this, too important for this, too smart to be taking orders from people who didn't recognize his so-called brilliance. And then, just as I had predicted, just as I had known would happen from the very beginning, he quit. He stormed out of the office one afternoon after being called out for a mistake, his pride too fragile to handle the reality of being held accountable, his frustration spilling over as he snapped at his supervisor. As he muttered something about how this place had never deserved him anyway, as he walked out of the building without a second glance, convinced that he was making some kind of grand exit when, in reality, no one cared enough to stop him. I sat in my office and watched from the window as he disappeared down the street, my expression unreadable, my emotions settled somewhere between satisfaction and quiet disappointment, because I had given him a chance to prove himself, a chance to rise above his own arrogance, a chance to finally back up all the things he had claimed to be, and he had thrown it away just as easily as he had dismissed my ambitions all those years ago. It didn't take long for the news to spread through the family, and as expected, the reactions were split down the middle. Some people praised me, told me that I had done the right thing, told me that it was about time Nathan faced the consequences of his own ego, while others called me petty, vindictive, accused me of setting him up to fail, of embarrassing him, of being just as cruel as they had always assumed I was. My mother, of course, was at the forefront of the outrage, furious beyond words, calling me to demand an explanation, to tell me that I had ruined my relationship with my cousin, that I had turned into something unrecognizable, something bitter, something cold, but I didn't argue with her, didn't bother justifying myself, didn't waste my breath trying to convince people who had never cared about my struggles that this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. I hadn't made Nathan fail. I had simply given him the opportunity to prove that he was more than just empty words. And he had shown everyone exactly who he was. As I sat in my office, listening to the distant hum of my employees working around me, feeling the weight of the past finally lift from my shoulders, I let myself wonder, just for a moment, if I had gone too far. If I had let my own resentment cloud my judgment, if I had taken things one step beyond what was necessary. But then, as I glanced at my phone and saw Nathan's name flash across the screen one last time, as I let the call ring out without answering, as I turned my attention back to the company I had built with my own hands, I realized that I didn't need anyone else's approval, didn't need anyone else's validation, didn't need my family to understand why I had done what I did. Because in the end, the only question that really mattered wasn't whether or not I had won, but whether or not Nathan had ever stood a chance in the first place. And as I watched his name disappear from my screen, I realized that I already knew the answer. But what about you? Would you have done the same?